Hello everyone, today we talk about the Gothic War, Clovis' Gaul, and the Justinian Reconquest. And these are topics that we have partly discussed, partly not. For example, we didn't tell much about the Gothic War yet. But as you know, I've been talking some time. If you go into my migration era playlist, you can see I've really looked at this mid-6th century with a lot of interest, and I like to reformulate sometimes my thoughts or to look at these things from a different perspectives, because it's a crucial moment in history that we often overlook. We often overlook for one reason, that we essentially see the mid of the 6th century like the kind of moment of crisis or kind of final collapse, especially for the West of the Western Europe properly. I mean, of late antique society, right? You know that in the mid-6th century there is this major epidemics that seemingly also in here we don't really know whether it was the main factor or surely was a determining one, not sure, and probably it was not really a decisive one, but let's say that there is a fast crisis, shrinking, regression, whatever you want to look at that, and it opens to what are even very darkly thought as the Dark Ages, in fact, and this is naturally a invalid interpretation, but at the same time, this is really objectively a moment of change, and we have to picture it like the end of something rather than the beginning of something else, or maybe of a simple transformation into a broader continuity that existed in here, especially between the Roman Empire at this point in its solid Mediterranean dimension and the European, let's say, the especially in the West, the Romano-Germanic kingdoms that had developed in the previous centuries, and now in certain cases were yet to be formed, as it will happen, for example, at the end of the Gothic War with the Longobards. So it's a moment that has caused a great debate, and I made already a couple of videos about this topic, chiefly for what concerns the, let's say, the validity, the motivation, justification of the Justinian Reconquest. That is, in fact, the process that at the end of the Gothic War had substantially brought the Western Mediterranean once again under the control of Constantinople, and let's say better, the direct control of the empire, right? And never underestimate the Constantinopolitan character now of the empire. It is pretty marked, and lots of things have changed over time, and the debate is huge fundamentally, in my opinion, mostly for because we don't, of course, we don't know much about the period in itself. We don't have the rational answer of the people that we would like to question at this time, of why, for example, the empire had invested so many resources objectively into the conquest of the Western Mediterranean. Generally speaking, there is this posteriori perspective that means fundamentally, now we know that the thing failed at the end of the day, that actually the Reconquest was successful, but it was doomed in some ways, but this already expresses a kind of judgment, and that's a very common thing to say, because we need to find the rational key of interpretation of history, right? History, like modern people, we like to reason like in this way. It gives us security to think that there is a sort of determinism that for which things have to change, right? And there are also other factors, including this idea that emperors and conquerors excuse me, in general have to be kind of egomaniacal people with kind of obsessions of grandeur that want to I think this is I personally, in recent times especially, I've tried to warn you about the importance, for example, of the Western perspective, that in a certain sense is, the Romano-Germanic perspective, let's say better, so the Western perspective of those times in a kind of an anti-Byzantine function, right? For saying that objectively, there was civilization even in the West, right? Especially the great, fans of the Roman Empire. I love the Roman Empire, as you know. I make a lot of videos about that, but I don't think they render justice to use a euphemism to the civil development of Western Europe, of the Latin Germanic world in this period, and it's a wide, deep topic, because naturally it has to be considered on a long period. Also in here I made many videos on the single questions, but never kind to make a synthesis at the end of the day. But I think, without going further in this introduction, as you understand there are lots of factors that have been considered, and I personally think that really the Byzantine Reconquest, the Justinian Reconquest, wasn't such a ill thought decision, and there are certain changes that also can not really be foreseen, and we would be amazed to see, in spite of what seems to us such a Bradivic rhythm of transformation, how actually dramatically under pressure these worlds were. Today we will try to look at this perspective as well, and how really the main strategy at that point was really gaining things fast at the moment, as long as you could, right? And that was most of the times the best option. Not to say that there weren't harsh decisions, not that we have to refuse and block the idea that the Justinian Reconquest was fundamentally all positive. Fundamentally, we will never know, but there is still a logic that has to take into consideration the various options and hypotheses, etc. So if you ever meet someone who says, I know better, it was like this or like that, just dismiss this kind of opinions, because they're based on nothing at the end of the day. You can't be sure about topics like this. We don't have enough information. As systems, it's dramatically complicated to reconstruct. But relatively to this mid-6th century, as I was saying before, I think the most important thing, the most interesting, at least fascinating for me, is to look at the relation that existed between the empire, the Roman Christian Empire, and the Romano-Germanic, and not only kingdoms, but also other populations. Think about the Slavs in this period that are not really anything like a unique block, or they don't form these kingdoms like the Germans had done in the West. They're still fundamentally expanding and defining their internal balance, etc. So that's something that lasts long. So that, for example, gives you the dimension how these systems were unstable by a certain degree all over the world. But there is this perspective that considers, in fact, a sharp distinction between what was happening in the West and what was happening in the East. Some other perspectives like to even mark difference between what was happening in the North and what was happening in the South. And it's curious because usually, objectively, what was the most massive changes and important things were happening in the South. And the North is taken sometimes like the paradigm of the early Middle Ages, especially because the historiographies of certain countries that eventually have become, kind of dominant, or had a great importance, like to tell the story from that perspective, but it's often way broader than that. And after all, these were not such dark ages as we think, especially depending on where you look, because it's obvious that if you look at the very far north, there is a situation that leads you to think, it's dark in the sense at least that the evidence is relatively scarce. If you go towards the south, not just to the Byzantine Empire, but also if you look at Spain, southern France, or Italy, that is so crucial for the balance, as we will see now, is, we know a lot objectively, and we still... or Africa, North Africa, for example. If you think at Vandal Africa, for example, that is reconquered by the Byzantines, you understand still how important that chunk of the empire had been, even culturally speaking. The great intelligentsia of the West, up to a certain point, comes from Roman Africa. Then it kind of passes towards Central and Southern Gaul, fundamentally. But aside from this, what I find crucial, and as I think the majority of my regular followers now at this point have really understood, is stressing how the empire proper was never, not only it was never over and never forgotten, but it kind of was the compass still of basically of most European populations at this point. Even in a kind of polemic dialectic, if we want to use it in this sense, a sense of enmity, as we see, as these were, there were substantial powers, take Frankish Gaul, etc., that had their own ambitions, and we've talked a bit about their spaces of attrition and so on. But at the same time, there is also this continuity that is intentional, and it's very marked, especially before the plague, before the crisis of the decline of the end of the 6th and the beginning of the 7th century in the Byzantine Empire, that truly looks at Europe as definitely something that wasn't lost to the empire, right? Something that the Central European populations perfectly knew, that theoretically there was this big empire from the Mediterranean that could strike back in many ways. Now, we know it didn't happen, or at least it happened in different, in kind of moderated form and with certain specific geographic boundaries, but it's still very important at this point, and it kind of dictates the relations and the dynamics that happened at this point. So there is, for example, let's start from the Vandals. The Vandals were this Germanic people, fundamentally, aside from the various hypotheses that exist in their ethnogenesis that would make this even partly Celts or even partly Proto-Slavs. But, we call them Germanic, always knowing what it can mean at this point, really, during the migration era, that create a kingdom into, I made a video on the Vandals, if you're interested, a brief history of them, the shining wonders of the migration era, because that's what Vandal actually means. And a lot of bad things also have been said about the Vandals. The Vandals are, in fact, the synonym, probably the worst barbarians conceptually believed to have been. But the story is very different. The reason why the Vandals have such a bad name in bad memory in Western historiography is essentially the papal propaganda of the 5th and 6th century, and there is one clear reason for this. That maybe now we shouldn't digress too much, but let's say that the popes had direct interests into Sicily at this point. The Vandals were they were Arians, so they weren't Catholics, but they fundamentally also the Goths were Vandals, were Arians, and the popes had different thoughts towards them. So there were many economical reasons at that point that fundamentally the Vandals seized the great latifundia that the popes had expanded into in Sicily. Theodoric, the king of the Ostrogoths, instead, when he conquers Italy, not only, albeit Arian, he is very respectful towards the Pope, but he also takes Sicily back from Vandal Africa. So Vandal Africa has all a history that even sparked at one point sort of what is called today a Vandal Renaissance. And there is objectively, it's been observed even on an archaeological basis that all these great persecutions, in fact, that the popes were claiming happening in Catholic Africa at the hand of the Arian Vandals, actually are not true. The diocese remained there. Probably was substitution of Catholic bishops with Arian ones, but let's say that we don't see this massive destruction of late antique civilization in there. The Vandals mostly suffered from this physiological cultural absorption that basically every Germanic people underwent when it settled down into Western Europe, let's say in the lands of the former Western Roman Empire, and that brought to kind of a lack of unity of command. There is this great leader, Gaiseric, that is basically one of the greatest Germanic monarchs of the migration era. He changed history, because part of the reason why the western half of the empire actually fell is Gaiseric. I mean, if Gaiseric, for example, had not even lived so long, it might have been, had been less decisive, etc. Might have well been that by the time of the Islamic conquests, assuming that they would have still happened, Roman Africa might have easily still been under a Western Roman Empire. But this is also another chapter. But the idea is that conquering the Vandal kingdom was important at the time of Justinian Reconquest, essentially for this name of Arians. So it was a way to reassert the Catholic faith in a symbolic way. It was regular imperial propaganda, and one of the duties of the emperor. I mean, at that time there was absolutely nothing strange to this. It was the regular thing, just like reconquering Rome. I mean, what does a Roman Empire have to do in his life? Well, I think reconquering Rome, if it's not under his direct control, is one thing. But as I was saying, in general, I think it made sense in broader strategic terms to reconquer the West. For the Vandals, it was a bit of a testing of, for example, the renewed Byzantine maritime capabilities, to show the power of the empire that arrives there and defeats the Vandals in 2 battles, and the kingdom disappears. Actually, the conquest of the Vandal kingdom was instrumental to the invasion of Italy. That was the biggest thing there, passing from Sicily. So basically, re-extending imperial control on these 2 major grain-producing regions of the Western Mediterranean, that could serve as a logistical base, a supply source for the campaign into Italy. That instead was a bit of a very difficult feat, or at least it would have not been so, at least if there hadn't been that switch at the top when Belisarius was removed, and if the Byzantines had maintained a bit of a guard, the Ostrogoths would have not striking back, and Italy would have not been destroyed in the process. The history of the Western world would have been radically different at that point, for so many reasons. But things happen, and it's interesting to say things happen. That at this point, really, this late antique world is already suffering a bit from, let's say, up to the mid-6th century, maybe not so evidently, but it's obvious that these systems have relatively reduced resources. So this is fascinating, because really even a single battle could wipe out a major resources in terms of manpower, supplies, etc. This is something not to be ever forgotten. In the 6th century, the world is pretty damn materially poor. You don't find resources so easily. This is dramatic, and it takes generations sometimes to regain what you have lost in a single battle. So that's why also this period is important, because from fairly little events, fairly small events, really a lot of our own history changed. Differently from other periods in history, where, let's assume, demographic resources for the army were virtually inextinguishable. Think about many battles. The Romans, many defeats, were even tens of thousands of Romans were killed, but at that time it didn't matter, or at least obviously mattered in some way. But if it was just for the men killed, or the economical resources, that those were things you could replenish pretty easily at that point. At this point, it's not really so, and that's why history could take so different radical paths, radically different paths. So even saying, it had to go that way is not really. And in any case, as I was saying before, we don't know enough. So in perspective, people criticized the Vandal Reconquest because it was said, like, this was a kind of a weak kingdom at this point. Really, the Byzantines didn't need to occupy it literally. After they could make of it a sort of a client states, like the Visigoths had been, for example. And also because from Byzantine Africa there were new rebellions that even overthrew the emperors in Constantinople. There were the Berbers harassing the Byzantine Africa, so that Constantinople had to pay a lot of resources just to contain these guerrillas, etc. But at that time, I think it kind of was a good idea. It was a solid base to attack Ostrogotic Italy. By the way, at that point, the Vandals and Ostrogoths that never quite liked each other, but they were essentially two Arian kingdoms fighting against a Catholic empire, so they might have had something in common too. But as I was saying before, the Byzantines wipe out the Vandals in an embarrassingly easy way. They get into Italy, and obviously from this perspective, you realize taking Africa, Sicily, is opening this maritime dimension towards the Italian peninsula, and for the value that naturally Rome had as the seat of the ancient Senate and of the most authoritative patriarchate of Catholicism, and also the Italic peninsula in itself, right? So as we were saying before, at this point Italy was still pretty wealthy. There wasn't the major the major damage was done during the Gothic War proper, and most because basically the armies made back and forth for 2 or 3 times from the north or the latitude of the peninsula, and causing irreparable damage. But this couldn't be known at the beginning. So actually reconquering such a rich, solidly populated, urbanized, and Mediterranean projected land like Italy seemed effectively a good idea. Talking about the value of the Senate, that is very important, and it has to do with the concept in general, because it was basically the Senate that had the Roman Senate that had called Constantinople to basically get rid of the Goths, of the Ostrogoths. So the Ostrogoths, as you know, were sent into Italy by the same at that point by the Roman Emperor, in the sense that the western half had already disappeared, so basically the empire was reunited and there was no west or east anymore. So theoretically Theodoric and later for a while his successors ruled on behalf of the Roman Emperor into Italy. That is a chapter that maybe one day we will look more into detail, but as you understand, this already put this area of the Mediterranean under not really the direct control of the Byzantines, but still, in solid contact, right? If you are an Ostrogotic king before, in this period, the problem you have is that the Byzantines are dramatically close to your shores. They have a pretty solid navy, which you don't have because you're not really extremely versed into maritime warfare as a people that came from basically from the steppes a relatively few time before. And still basically you live within a Roman world. The Ostrogotic Kingdom is one of probably it's the happiest example of Romano-Germanic coexistence. But the elite, the senatorial elite, that in fact ruled jointly with let's say administrated Italy during Ostrogotic rule, while the Ostrogoths were all about the army, so fit, because these were the great landowners fundamentally, to re-enter within formally, so not just economically speaking, but also politically, institutionally, within the the Roman Empire, and they didn't like the Goths in this sense because they wanted to get rid of them in some way. The Goths had problems on their own, meaning that, as we have said, they were Arians, and they didn't want to give up their can say their faith, because much of Arianism actually has to do with political, presentability in front of the Romans rather than a true belief. The Goths were probably largely, maybe not largely pagan proper, but let's say that their Christianity was imperfect in so many ways. Although, yeah, there were some of the Goths were some of the Germans that converted the first to Christianity, and also they basically converted other Germanic peoples, and that's why there were so many Aryans among the Germans, because more or less the Goths had interacted with all the other Germans in this way. The only Germans that didn't undergo through this were basically the Franks, and partly the Anglo-Saxons. The northern, the far north of Europe, that however had a kind of a different history, eventually was re-evangelized in other ways. Think about Anglo-Saxon England, still with contacts with Rome, so in a different way they didn't need to pass through Arianism. And in case of the Franks, it was particularly important, and we will see it later what that specifically meant, and why it was a very happy choice for the Franks and the Merovingian dynasty, if you really want to be more specific in that case. So the Senate took the Roman Senate. As you know, Constantinople had a Senate on its own, but the Roman Senate, and they didn't like very much each other. Like the senators of Rome were extremely, and rightfully I would say, they had this sense of superiority because objectively they were more educated, had a more ancient nobility, etc., than the Constantinopolitan Senate that had integrated other elements from kind of different worlds with a bit more of a standardized form of education, not really stemming from the real aristocracy, but also creating a new one. They didn't quite like each other, but they. After the death of Theodoric, they take the various succession struggles and the weakness of certain sovereigns to force hand and calling the Byzantines in. Now, the problem of Arianism of this, essentially few tens of thousands of warriors. Actually, obviously these populations had migrated into. Together with the rest of the population, but they probably never exceeded the 100,000s. Like some of the largest confederation, let's say, groups ever migrating were the Longobards, that also seemingly, not necessarily reached the 100,000s inhabitants. Italy here had several millions still, in spite of all. So you realize that there is a brute. Let's say a brutal imbalance in the process, and it had started to happen what was happening in Spain with the Visigoths and in Africa with the Vandals. That is that at a certain point the monarchy had to make a choice whether to insist on Arianism and creating all the problem with this very strong clergy and church that existed now. There were regions of ancient Christianization, were Catholic, solidly Catholic. They were the majority of the people. So actually, for the Ostrogoths and the Vandals, this didn't quite happen because they were wiped out by the Byzantines. But for the Visigoths, for example, at a certain point they convert to Catholicism. Also, the Visigoths actually were quite lucky to exist, because at one point if it hadn't been for the Vandals really cutting short Majorana's expeditions, they would have simply surrendered to the Romans. They actually had already done a proof that the Western Empire, even up to the 60s of the 5th century, could still go on really without excessive difficulties. But in spite of what is commonly believed, but aside from that, there is this process eventually of Catholicization that eliminated the problems. The Goths now, excuse me, I drink a little before, because I hear about this point. I want to express myself without being thirsty enough. Excuse me. So the reason why these populations didn't want to give up Arianism was in many ways what this represented from an international standpoint. It's not that these people really cared about this being Arian or Catholic. The real problem was that Arianism in itself was basically a declaration of Germanism in the international arena, which meant the following. The Germans actually wanted to be part of the empire. They wanted to share imperial power, even though they never quite reached that level, but they wanted to share the idea that of controlling certain areas of the empire. That's how they had been settled. This is a very long story. Actually, it began as soon as Rome arrived at the borders of Germany, even invaded it. There were so many different communities that were settled and Romanized by the empire. But at this point, during the 6th century, as you know, things are a bit different. So the empire cannot contain any more of these people. So what it had started to do is simply settling them in two large areas, especially trying, as far as possible from the center of Roman power, like the Byzantines had done, telling the truth. Because the Eastern Roman Empire sent, for example, lots of peoples against even the West, getting rid of them, and think about the Visigoths, etc. But even when the West didn't quite exist anymore, even the Ostrogoths were this looming threat in the Balkans that the Byzantines would want to get rid of, so they sent it to Italy at that point. So that's how they had dealt with the story. And there was this ambiguity for which, obviously, for the Germans, the notion of monarchy was something really new in many ways. Especially, this was evident in the moment of sedentarization, because previously the Germans had been fundamentally semi-nomadic. So even the monarchic institution that, in some forms, had been necessary because of the sake of military command during the migration, etc., was considered elective, etc., was to transform into something more consolidated. So the problem is that Arianism in itself contained the idea that this newly formed kingdoms wanted to be kind of partners of the empire, but not quite part of the empire. And also, on this base, they kind of refused partly to integrate with the local population, but not because they really cared. For example, we know that women, Germanic women, kind of converted immediately and kind of solid predisposition for the local fashion, customs, and practices. Many of them even converted to Catholicism in the process. We know it even from archaeology. Now that's pretty interesting because, by the way, women in this context have even a very important role of social relation, even with the communities where when their husbands went to war somewhere else, they were sometimes left in charge of the dialogue with the local communities. They had even this diplomatic involvement within the boundaries that were prescribed from them in the Germanic tradition. But the point is that, especially for demographic reasons, this kingdoms cannot work on that formula. You can't have the few tens of thousands of warriors that are ideally all German and Aryan that control the land, and no mixing, and by mixing, not really at a genetical level, of course, but mixing even in kind of ideals, models of government, etc. Obviously, as soon as the Germans settled, they underwent a very intense process of Romanization. This is particularly evident in southwestern Europe, that were the wealthiest, more densely populated areas. So it's not that the Germans could really impose themselves on Iron Fist. They didn't have the manpower, fundamentally. So the tensions and the attritions that did exist sometimes between the Catholics and the Arians, albeit not bringing to these radical persecutions that sometimes we could think of, were mostly dramatic in the dimension in which they were challenging the monarchic model on the Germanic ideal, or at least what had been firstly created in an opposition to Constantinople. Because what was the risk at the end of the day? The risk was that if this ethnic base had fundamentally blended in the territory, the king would have kind of lost contact with his clientele and would have had to create, to adapt to the local structures, to the local nobility. This is something, for example, that happened in Spain on the long run, Visigothic Spain. And that equated, in theory, that not just this element would have been the Germanic element would have been Romanized at the end of the day, but especially that Constantinople could claim back those lands at a point in which this Germanic control would have vanished in some sort, so that these powers would have been reabsorbed by the empire. And this is not so physiological as it sounds. I mean, the threat and the Gothic War perfectly exemplifies that, is that the Byzantines definitely had the strategic, logistical capabilities to invade these countries, and that's how it happened. That's how it happened for Spain. For Africa, for Italy, for Spain too, telling the truth, but not wiping out the Visigoths, but really seizing, however, the wealthiest areas of Spain in the very south. So, the most intensely Romanized areas. So, as you understand, this was a normal attrition. And so what happened with the Reconquest of the terrible, it's a good adjective to describe it, a Gothic War, it was the final collapse of the Ostrogotic Kingdom and the reabsorption in the Byzantine element, right? So the Gothic War really went on for 18 years, 535, 553. It was, as we were saying before, pretty intense. It was a mess, really. Italy was destroyed, and yet, it kind of maintained also certain characteristics, but it was a very, very heavy blow, and it changed late antique culture forever. In many ways, even if it had remained under Byzantine control in the long run, still it would have been very difficult to control. And not just because, for example, the Longobards arrived, but because, for example, the Franks also had, at the very end of the Greek of the Gothic War, the Franks, and together with some Alemanni clients, went up to, they invaded Italy, launching these raids that arrived up to the very south of Italy. Not the very south of Italy, but that's where they were defeated by Narses, the Imperial army. So that was a risk, and even in fact, the same Longobard settlement, aside from what the general ideal is was very probably actually required by the same Byzantines, because they thought, with some degree of optimism at that point, to be able to, to frame to the Longobards, to put them in, especially in the north, creating this client state, this buffer state that could repel the Frankish invasions with Imperial backing. Then things went out of hand, and as you know, what happened. We have an entire dedicated playlist dedicated to the Longobards. So if you're interested, go take a look to that. So and I must say that even this may be unnecessary, but let's say even the Longobard migration that is often conceived, that's been I've heard some of the worst terrible definitions to describe the Longobard invasion of Italy, but it wasn't truly like that. At least there were certain aspects of it that have really nothing to do with the violence, as it's often seen. The Longobards are grotesquely depicted once again here because of the papal propaganda, right? Because Papal Rome is freaking well documented for this time standard, so we know a lot of things. And naturally, the Pope was still theoretically within the Byzantine Empire, and trying to regulate the Italian affairs was, in opposition to the Longobards. They were Arians as well, but really barely Christian in the first place. Still, they were largely pagans at that point. But they had to depict these guys as the enemies, And that's pretty obvious if you consider that there were Byzantine armies that, together with the Frankish ones, were trying to wipe out the Longobards. They didn't manage to do that. So it is normal for those times to call the enemy with kind of the worst possible names, or with the picturing them in ways that are different. But actually, especially these Germanic populations, you don't really destroy a place where you're going to settle, right? One thing is passing by, like for example the Vandals had done objectively in some areas of southwestern Europe. But even when they settled into Africa, it's not that they kind of destroyed a big deal of stuff, right? One thing is warfare of conquest that actually the same Byzantines carried out with the same exact ways the Germans did. Which are the normal ways war is fought rationally and intelligently of the time, including scorched land strategy and stuff like that seem kind of devastating things, and they definitely are, but they're also functional to something. But also this cruelty, this terrible barbarity of the Longobards is a long acknowledged historiographical myth as such, and it mostly happened in areas where there was actual warfare, prolonged warfare between the Byzantines and the Longobards, but also in there it happened for internal dynamics of the Longobard people, especially at the beginning, rather than because of their alleged ferociousness. We need to think that surely these weren't gentle souls, and they did lots of destructions and massacres, but who didn't really at the time. Yeah, I realize there is a perspective of kind of Civile idea, for which naturally these populations coming from Central Europe, Northern Europe weren't quite of a, they were more primitive, less organized. That's really what makes the difference, more than violence in itself. Because if you really study the stories here, aside from the ethnographical cliches, you realize that these guys did things that were solidly logical in many ways, and it's just us at 15 centuries afterwards pretending that we can judge on the basis of things we don't even know at the end of the day. But aside from this, I don't want to get ideological more than necessary, but it's important even to tell these perspectives. So the case of Italy is fundamental, because there is a long tradition of what we were telling before about this sort of delegation of imperial control to certain Germanic chieftains on the large areas of the West. And as we have seen, Italy was particularly important for Constantinople itself. It was very important for Constantinople to say, okay, let's have a solid contact with the papacy, with the Roman Senate. That helped their Mediterranean coordination in many ways, right? And in spite of the hostilities also that existed, and as you know, there had been the Odoacer in Italy that had deposed the last Western Roman emperor. That wasn't actually really the very last, because it was also Nepos that is never counted usually, but whatever it was, Odoacer was really just, he was not at the head of a people, but let's say of the multiple, let's say corps, but that's even a big word, let's say of bands of Germanic warriors that already made up the army of the Italian peninsula at that point. And that he basically gives back the imperial vexilla to Constantinople, saying, okay, I basically recognize you as sole emperor. Let's stop electing Western emperors in here, because it actually creates more problems than good, and so that I can get back some sort of recognition. Unfortunately for Odoacer, that had an initial, was initially in relative harmony with the Byzantines. The Byzantines had to get rid of the Ostrogoths, as we said before. So in 489, they sent him and his Theodoric and his whole people against Odoacer. That gets killed, and basically the Ostrogoths take over really the Kingdom of Italy, because at this point, or better, Theodoric was recognized as king within this region. So this what is interesting from the Ostrogotic perspective is, aside from the sound cooperation that especially initially existed between the Goths and the Romans, is that there was this intrinsic recognition, fundamentally, of Constantinople as the supreme vertex of the empire, and of course of the Byzantine emperor as such. So it's particularly important because from one side it shows you the collapse of the imperial institution in the West, right? Or better, not much the institution, but the imperial administration at the end of the day. So what could be effectively controlled directly from imperial institutions on the territory. But on the other hand, it proved that Constantinople was still managing this area, that it was still the reference point, and this is very overlooked, right? And I must say I'm not an expert of Ostrogotic Byzantine relations in this point, but there is a literature about this. But the idea is that somebody basically says, oh well, once the Ostrogoths settled in Italy, well, they were basically like doing on their own, right? Even if they had an imperial delegation, they were still doing whatever they liked. Well, this is not really true. Not much, because the Ostrogoths, like any other people, of course, wanted to rule on their own. But rather for the most obvious threat that Constantinople posed to Italy and whoever ruled in there, right? So that was not something you could really not take into account. The Byzantines now invest a freaking huge amount of resources to reconquest all the West, and obviously the Western Mediterranean. Obviously, these populations knew that. I mean, Theodoric knew it. The Vandals knew it. It's not that they could do much, right? The Vandals had been lucky back in the day to sink the whole Eastern Roman fleet, and that would have been something that otherwise would have really wiped them out much before, and probably would have made the Western Roman Empire survive, for example. But this goes beyond even the same strategical elements. Let's say that even the Germans, as we said before, were actually searching for a space within the empire. They recognized the empire was something that existed beyond whoever was emperor, realistically speaking. The Germans essentially believed that they had somehow managed to take part of let's say, of the glory, of the favor of the celestial deity that the empire represented. Here it doesn't matter we're talking about the Christian god or the celestial deity of the sky in the Indo-European mythology. Here the idea of the empire was deeply rooted into this concept. So hence the ambiguity, even partially, that existed between the fact that the Germans had converted to Arianism, right? Because it was a superstitious world in many ways. These were fundamentally worlds that came from a polytheistic background that at this time was all but forgotten or erased. And it's normal for a polytheist, or what we call as a polytheist, because it's actually a monotheistic term, to take literally every single deity within his own pantheon, let's say, right? If you take the same Clovis, basically he traded his conversion to Christianity for victory in battle, right? That was literally it. That's the typical contractualistic pagan mindset that eventually, well, of course, according to the hagiographic presentation, is yeah, okay, eventually Clovis truly converted and all, and the Franks became all Catholic, but naturally the thing was much more shaded, and changes were very slow. But for the elites, it was equally important to say feel to share that imperial power in some ways. And that was not, as I always say, an empire like all others. That's what we should make really a deep effort to understand. And exactly on this religious root of the time, if the empire was like at that point the most powerful thing that existed, doesn't matter that most of the West was lost, right? It was still the ecumenical empire, and at different levels of distortions. The Mediterranean was central. The Mediterranean was, the most developed areas, the richest ones, and that's where, in fact, the most solid Romano-Germanic kingdoms are built, right? Because they partly inherit the Roman administration, the various managing the various local traditions, the infrastructures in part, etc., the know-how, the intelligentsia, sometimes. So at the end of the day, however, the Byzantine Empire was the most powerful thing that was out there. Point. End of the story. They had a projection capability that none of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms could ever dream to have. And the Justinian Reconquest actually proves this. They wiped out two major Romano-Germanic kingdoms. They expanded towards the Western Mediterranean. And that was a big goal, right? It had showed the greatness of Constantinople in its solid, in its wealth, in its organizational capabilities, in its military strength. Ostrogotic Italy at the end of the day was conquered, as we have seen, after 18 years of bloody conflict. But even the fact that the Vandals had fallen, that the Byzantines had this solid military and navy, etc., had brought, previous to the invasion, of this Byzantine envelopment of Ostrogotic Italy into the Mediterranean, right? And had demonstrated this exceptional vigor of the empire. Exceptional one. This is not something you can take out of the equation, right? It's based on several advantages and several capabilities that the empire has at this time that proves still the effectiveness of the Roman Empire, its military, even its political guidance, etc. Something that the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, as we have seen before, are struggling to build. Like the Latin Germanic world takes, even after the Byzantines have to give up the reconquest of the West, especially with the Islamic conquest and so on, but not only, also the revival of previously with the war with the Persians, other populations that are knocking at the door. It took a lot of time before they built something, and eventually what had been the Roman state kind of fails. It simply disappears into the West. At the end of the day, you have the vassalic beneficiary system being the only glue that manages to keep, from which it's possible to develop something more stable and more centralized, paradoxically speaking. It's the Islamic tradition that instead is able to build a real state in Spain, for example, but that crumbles as well, and the Byzantines as well on the long run. And it's paradoxically Western feudalism that takes over as a model, right? And from which eventually the modern states will be formed. Now, these are interesting perspectives, but at that time, obviously, nobody really knew what the world was going. I mean, Wu does, really, in his own time. So all the struggle between Arians and Catholics, this ambiguities with the empire, with the objective fear that the empire could invade you, and this that was proved during the Justinian Reconquest, brought still today's populations in Western Europe to say, okay, you know what, the empire is always there. We can't forget it. We can't live as if we were doing on their own. And it would have been silly to do it also because the empire could in fact delegate you to rule on those lands. So with Italy, to conclude, there was the effective annexion of the peninsula into the political administrative apparatus of the Eastern Empire, right? And Rees, and as a proof that actually Italy is so important and it's part of a broader ambition, and that's the topic really that today I would like to point out that I think I didn't discuss in those other things, is what really the Byzantines were thinking to do at that point. Right, and a key element in here is the city of Ravenna. Now, Ravenna, as you know, was already the seat during the 5th century, the seat of the Imperial court of the West, eventually of Odoacer and Theodoric. It's interesting that the West had this different administrative capitals, but it was still Rome the capital. This is something that is often forgotten. You know, there are the cities like Milan, Ravenna, Pavia eventually, but you know, Rome is still, you know, the honorary capital. It always remains so. But the court obviously switched location, as it was normal at the time, and or partially, and especially in the West. Of course, the East had a relatively different story, but also in there, in fact, transformation had occurred over time in the opposite direction. So what happens when the Byzantines reconquer Ravenna is that they make it the seat of an exarch sent by Constantinople. So this is an official that actually collects both the civil and military power of the whole peninsular Italy, and that is appointed directly by the empire, right? By the emperor, and that tells you that, you know, there were similar figures elsewhere, but you know, Ravenna was relatively far from the rest of the empire, and yet the Byzantines want to control it. So why? So, as we were saying before, the exarch, first of all, is there to control chiefly the military organization at the end of the day, and the religious and civilian life of the of this let's say Romano-Italic appendix of the Byzantine Empire. But it was probably a sort of bridgehead, I think, an advanced position towards more far. This is a perspective that I don't think it's taken into consideration, because then we all know what happened. The Longobards arrived, and at the end of the day, the Byzantines have to give up even the idea of reconquering Italy from the Longobards. But previously to that, what was this Reconquest really for, and was it all? Naturally, we have seen that the limits of the Justinian Reconquest were fundamentally the limits of late antique, the boundaries of late antique civilization, right? Culture. So basically, the Byzantines reconquered all those lands where the old Romano-Hellenistic system worked. You know, places where you had cities, latifundia, roads, access from the sea. So places that were different, for example, from certain areas of Central Europe that had never quite been so intensely Romanized, but at least in relative terms, that had quickly turned reverse into different ways. I mean, take northern Gaul or the Rhineland or the Danubian area. You know, those had never been quite very intensely Romanized. But even northern Spain, for example, there were islands within the borders of let's say the previous borders of the Roman Empire that had, think about the Bagaude revolt, etc. That, you know, that proves that Rome had hadn't really gone so deep into, in social engineering. They didn't quite care. The Roman Empire had, in many ways, a much more decentralized and superficial rule that it was commonly thought. And what you see in the late Roman Empire is, in fact, the intensification of the local structures of control, really for controlling, in fact, this more than else the Mediterranean world, leaving as the center of the real wealth of power, manpower, etc., leaving the let's say what was in the north, like this great frontier. Take the Balkans, for example. Like, you can't say that civilization in the Balkans at this point is essentially along the coast. The same Constantinople, the Greek cities, etc. The hinterland gets quickly depopulated. At this point, it actually gets Slavicized, by the way. But you can find this example also elsewhere, even in the same Italy, even in the same Spain. So it's interesting to follow the boundaries of the Reconquest, because they are effectively same boundaries of where the ancient world, let's say the late antiquity as a civilization can live. And it's interesting because this already shows the contraction of the ancient world as a whole, because even the Roman Empire at the peak of its expansion did follow certain limits. There are the limits of agriculture, of the vineyards, of certain ability of let's say possibility of commercial penetration. It's not that the Romans controlled territories just like that. They thought about it thoroughly, and they surely knew their own business. That's also why they abandoned Germany, or also they didn't push forward to places like Scotland, or they abandoned eventually certain areas, because these were rational capabilities. It was simply a ratio of costs benefits. Point. End of the story. That passes through an assessment that naturally can bring to things like see the disaster, Teutoburg Forest, but it's not really the defeat, the ultimate defeat. It's also rational choice. After all, the Romans were, especially for Germany, they remained somewhat undecided, because they tried to invade it once, other 2 or 3 times. Eventually, they didn't do it, but also in there. But let's say that there is a logic for these forms of expansion. Now, what it's possible, though, and I'm starting to suspect, is that the Byzantines in the mid-6th century, however, wanted to, or at least definitely conceived, to bring their expansion further, right? Why is this? We have just said that there is a logic that is following late antique culture. Bringing beyond these boundaries is saying, is bringing. There must have been some other reason, and I think there is a valid reason. There is a sort of preemptive, kind of a, preemptive strategy towards the Franks, like. This choice of projecting towards the northwest, essentially, is to be framed in the interest that the Imperial court of Constantinople, actually even before Justinian, to tell the truth, had showed towards especially Gaul. This is very important, because Gaul is a composite province, right? Gaul, as we've seen since the ancient world, it was inhabited by different population: the Celts, the Aquitanians, then partly also by the Germans, or something that they got mixed. Then, of course, had been Romanized, and actually Gaul was really one of the most, not just one of the most intensely Romanized provinces of the empire, because as we said before, especially southern Gaul was dramatically Romanized, like very, very, very intensely Romanized, a bit like southern Spain, a bit like central and southern Italy, and other regions of the empire. The north was so-so, in the sense that yeah, it was soundly Romanized. It also, Gaul has certain environmental characteristics, even how the rivers and the network and the urban centers are deployed, that makes it actually very easy to control, strategically speaking. Gaul is one of those areas that, you ask the Germans during World War II, that they spent the vacation in there once they occupied France with a very few troops. But other cities, other regions of the world are renowningly terrible, like Spain and Italy. Ask the Byzantines, in fact, in the 6th century, or ask even the Germans during World War, or the Allies during World War II, for that matter. Because certain things never change. This is interesting in terms of geography and battlefields and strategy. But Gaul had also another great quality that is never to be forgotten. That is, first of all, Gaul has always been very wealthy. Like, since the ancient world, the agricultural resources of France are widely renowned. These are wide areas that knew, pretty intense trade, traffics, solid agricultural production. It was a world that in many ways was heading towards a rapid development. Absolutely nothing to do with Germany, right? Germany was a living hell. It was full of forests, swamps. Nobody wanted to be there, except the Germans. This is what Tacitus says. It's colder. It's so when people say, oh, well, it was so easy to conquer Germany for the Romans, in theory, because Gaul was, they had already conquered Gaul. Well, you're talking about two radically different regions of Europe, especially at the time. But Gaul had one characteristic that, in the perspective of the transformation of the Roman Empire, made it so desired and looked upon with hunger, let's say, with lust. It was the fact that Gaul had actually not undergone the massive distractions of other regions of the empire. Take Italy, for example. That with the Gothic War, we were seeing what happened there. So it was an area that, despite like Gaul was invaded by several populations that crossed it, including the Vandals, we named before, the Alans, then partly then other populations, but it was even the Huns had gone there, but there hadn't never been a systemic collapse of late antique culture at the end of the day. Like, it was more the environment that, obviously from the north to south, kind of changed it by some degree, but it was a place where, after all, the Gallo-Roman civilization had remained, fairly solidly strong, right? And this was probably not enough for the Byzantines to say, okay, well, go there and take it. The problem was really that another population, the Franks of Clovis, had extended the control on this huge plains of central Western Europe, that from the Pyrenees to, well, up to actually beyond in the northeast, the boundaries of Gaul itself. I mean, this great fertile Atlantic plains that gave to the Franks this enormous resources. Like, the Merovingian expansion is impressive. Everybody freaked out, including the big Byzantines. At one point becomes overstretched. The Franks, as you know, do not, even eventually, yet when the Goths are wiped out in Italy, they immediately want to occupy it, because actually the major sensible decision at that point is, if there is a strong France and a weak Italy, the thing for France is to invade Italy. Yeah, right. But even if Italy is not weak, or at least that's the major area you want to expand towards too. So, and that's what the Franks do, basically. The Franks go in there, and they start to contend the peninsula from the Byzantines. For a bit, they scout in there, they explore what the situation is, and the Byzantines know that, and that's why even the arrival of the Longobards probably is not so random at the end of the day. Even the fact that the Longobards were pushed away by the Avars is a myth. Actually, the others, when the Longobards leave the Pannonian area, they're not that solid kingdom that the Khanate that will become later in a few decades, but still not when the Longobards are probably, they weren't very, very comfortable neighbors to live with. But what brings the Longobards into Italy is very likely even the same Byzantine invitation. It's probable that they do it on their own at one point. It would have been obvious to fill that gap, with especially after the war. But the fact that the Byzantines basically did not react to the Longobards invasion immediately, and they simply, everything was fine in the empire, they didn't even move, really makes us suggest that it was probably really an invitation, right? And also in here, maybe I will have to make a video to explain in detail the sources, because there is even Narses' legend that says basically the Byzantines, that Narses was calling the Longobards against Justinian into Italy because he was jealous. But it's actually this is a text that is very, it's not very credible. Also because Narses eventually was given, state funerals in Constantinople, and you really do not celebrate a person like Narses that actually had been a great, serve of the empire, let's say, if he betrays the empire by letting these barbarians in without and it probably conceals instead, because eventually, as we know, the Longobards became enemies to the Byzantines. But at that point, previously, that probably it's something that was made up later to kind of partly justify how it had happened. That partly reflects naturally the jealousies and etc. that had occurred into the empire, but within these men of power. But it had been a bit like with Belisarius, right? That Narses, the Justinian takes away Belisarius, and Narses is sent there. So, what I want to observe is, evidently the Byzantines had immediately understood, and probably they knew it even before starting the Reconquest in the Western Mediterranean, that the Franks were a great problem, right? So it's even courageous, and it reveals a lot of momentum to know the inherent challenge that the Merovingian kingdom now can pose to even to the Byzantine-held territories in the Mediterranean, and still to invade those, to get there, and to even create this exarchate so close to, into northern Italy, basically, so to make it a center of coordination of things that were going on. The Byzantines had basically understood that something would have gone on there, that there was there was the need for a strong yet decentralized power into Italy to cope with things that had to happen, right? And to reacquire, besides reacquiring all the imperial, let's say, legacy of Italy and the ancient, the capital both of Ravenna and Rome, and so on. But there is more. There is probably this conscientious choice to challenge the Franks and to possibly think even not just to remain confined into the Mediterranean as a Byzantine lake, essentially, but to project themselves even towards the Atlantic and passing through Gaul at that point, because the Byzantines do not care much about Spain, because probably the Visigoths are not much of a threat. The Visigoths will actually conquer Byzantine Spain like towards the end of the 7th century, so shortly before the Arabs conquered them. However, there was this idea that southern Gaul especially could be recovered probably, and there is a lot of ambiguity relatively to this interpretation, but nevertheless this makes you understand the potential of that, because as we were saying, especially southern Gaul, the Rhone Valley especially, was a massively Romanized region. Like, it was kind of like a part, even Italy, actually, because there are very strong similarities between the Rhone Valley and even if you continue in the west, you know, with Septimania fundamentally, so between Provence and Spain, you realize that there is this channel of connection with even the Iberian coast, etc. That is something very ancient, really. Think about the Massilian Empire, even with Empurias, you know, this great belt basically between Italy and Spain, that is a great commercial area of ports that control the trade through the Rhone Valley with Central Europe, and it's close to Italy, it's close to Spain, so two areas that are very rich, so an area of great management. And in fact, we do find in southern Gaul during the 6th century the Roman cities in there that at this point were basically suspensed into this theoretic nothingness, because there was no real central government in there. Like, both the Franks, the Goths, and the Byzantines were too far from really saying, I rule in southern Gaul. But the southern Gallic cities mint money with you know, the imperial money, you know, claiming basically they were part of the empire. And not just, you know, anecdotally or theoretically, but, you know, like, we are part of this big commercial thing that is the Mediterranean, that is fundamentally dominated by the empire, right? So we have no information, as far as I know, of any Byzantine expedition into southern Gaul or something like that. But it's obvious that the boundaries of the empire at this point are pretty blurred, right? So where can we trace this Byzantine interest in here? Excuse me. Well, for example, so remember always that Gaul is a land that belongs to Rome. Like, the goal of the Romans is to reconquer everything that had at least belonged to the empire. And then, of course, even as an ecumenic empire, it has to look far and say, okay, well, theoretically we should be able to conquer the whole world, because the world is God's world and we are God's empire, and so that's how it has to be. So if you look at, for example, obviously the Byzantines recognized that the Franks had invaded Gaul, right? And they had even conferred, in fact, to the king of the Franks, Clovis, at the beginning of the 6th century, so when the Franks in Gaul were preponderant, basically, the consular insignia and the title of patrician. Now, this is very important. This is something that actually, it's basically the vicary of Gaul, right? This is something that the Merovingians will be totally in love with, and it's something that even the Carolingians will ideally recover. I mean, the Franks, and that's why I think it was relevant what I was saying before, we're thinking at that point to be sort of a sort of para-empire. It's a difficult concept to formulate, to define, actually, but it's this idea that if you are received the consular, if you're interested in the consular insignia, this means that you are a consul of Rome. What does this mean? Well, it means basically you have the Imperium. And this is, I'm not even sure whether there was a strict geographic dimensioning here. I mean, but it's the only, and that's why it's important also to probably think that there wasn't anything like this, meaning that at that point receiving just the consular insignia simply meant that you were recognized by the empire, that kind of power. Doesn't matter where, but if you were basically a consul of the empire. And the patrician title, well, the patrician title was necessary for the for some magistracies, covering some magistracies in the cursus honorum of the empire, and it was a title that many Germanic chieftains had received. But the consular insignia, well, those are a thing, right? Because those really tell you can rule in here. Actually, as a military commander, never underestimate also how the empire flattered the Germanic warrior ideal. The concept that they had conquered these lands. Like the Germanic warrior, aside from what could understand, I mean, the average one really thought it was a very simple-minded individual. He thought, whoever I win, I deserve to rob and to substitute. Basically, it's simple as that, and that's not actually very different from any tribal society. Naturally, the Frankish elites, from which Clovis came from, were kind of more sophisticated than this, relatively at least. The episode of the Vase of Soissons is dramatically beautiful in this regard. I made now a Frankish history playlist if you're interested about these stories. I've been talking a lot about Clovis and his race to power and how this Frankish power was dimensioned within Gaul and the broader imperial ideal. So, and that's something I'm very, very fascinated by. So it's the concept that you're part of something greater, you're part of the empire, you're legitimized, and you're basically conscious about the legitimacy of your own ruling there. This is something that obviously we, looking at kind of a long time range perspective can sound kind of forced as an interpretation, but if you really think about it, France always had this maintained from these times, really, this mentality. I mean, the idea that they were a country that had a pretty well-defined identity, with even very clear geographical let's say, maybe not excessively clear geographical boundaries, because what you have here is this massive Atlantic plains that we were talking about before, and then there is the Massif Central, then there are the Alps, and then there is the Rhine. But let's say that this big chunk of Atlantic plains, that's where ideally the French power has to expand. They kind of had their own church, right? They start developing, at this point, the Merovingian Gallic liturgy is starting to develop as something on their own. They are a freaking big military power. Like France, as long as it was united, historically speaking, was always kind of the aside from before a united Germany, at an hegemonic sort of, tendentially, or hegemonic power and solid terrestrial power. And there is this idea that they are a let's say a monarchy, or at least a state or something. Well, of course, the revolution has changed the concept of monarchy with the state, but there is a really big, a strong continuity in many ways between the French, let's say, what was founded really by at the time. And I know it's anachronistic, it's debatable, it's forced in some ways, but if you really think about it, especially the idea of Neustria, like this territory north of the Loire River and the center of Frankish power, has always been, even ethno-linguistically, something different. Like, think about the Langue d'Oil from the Languedoc, for example. This difference between the north and the south, different cultures, different tongues, different landscapes, different neighbors, and so on. That was kind of fairly unitary, and this is something that starts from Clovis, and it goes on as in a kind of an imperialistic sense, because today we know, I mean, modern France, we think at France, simplistically speaking, but if you look at the construction of the French state, well, that's something that basically started from this French north that is narrowly French into this north, and that expands on this other kind of nations that had existed. Take Aquitaine, Burgundy, other areas even of Alsace, etc. Well, those are, roughly speaking, what this had been now: Visigothic Aquitaine, Burgundian Burgundy, Alemannia, let's say Alemannia and Swabia, we can say. So it's a broader, of course. Then there is also the northeastern appendix. That would be today's Benelux and parts of northwestern Germany that are this more intensely Germanic area, because like Neustria becomes fundamentally a Romance, Neo-Latin entity. If anything, look at the tongue. Austrasia in the northeast remains something different, but also at this point still very connected to the empire, to the Frankish kingdom. Despite eventually the kingdom will, the empire proper by certain standards, and will split into four. But this is the idea that there is a center that can make an imperial policy. And that's what the Franks, that had basically come out of the forests of Western Germany just a few generations before, literally. Literally in the sense that they hadn't, they were very different from what Clovis transformed them into. They came to regard, at least in the elites that eventually built up the Merovingian kingdom, as sort of emperors. Gaul had been, the Franks were basically coming from this Germanic tribes of northwestern Germany, and they had, these were basically the same tribes, just with other names, that had participated, just to make an example, to battle the Teutoburg forest, right? They were the Germans, they were at the closest contact with the Romans in many ways. So Gaul, in their mindset, had kind of always belonged to the Romans, because as long as they arrived to Gaul themselves, well, they found Caesar that was incidentally arriving from the other direction, and confined them to Germany, and therefore having, in a century-long perspective, it was finally having seized its enormous territory that was urbanized, solidly sedentary agriculture. Well, Germany was, as we have seen, very primitive, wild, and area, savage and poor, also fundamentally. That's what had brought the Germans also to migrate at one point, at least part of the reasons why. So they were, especially the elites, as was saying, that led this expansion, and chiefly Clovis, that founds this monarchy that was completely different from any tradition that these Western Germans had ever had, and they transform it even beyond it, more than a monarchy. They transform it into an empire proper, right? This is not something that is so pronounced in, for example, in Visigothic Spain, nor in Ostrogotic Italy, for example, because Visigothic Spain has, it basically is born across Aquitaine and northeastern Spain. Then the Franks take away Aquitaine from the Visigoths, that switch the center into the very center of the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, and from there the kings try to make these campaigns all over the Iberian Peninsula. That is also freaking huge, as much as France, if not more. If I remember, yes, I think France is bigger, for example, than Spain, but Spain plus Portugal are larger, territorially speaking. And they attack also because the Visigoths weren't the only Germanic people in the Iberian Peninsula. There were parts of the Swabians that had migrated in there. There were other chunks even of the Alans and other peoples. Well, so they try a bit this sort of imperialistic, policy, but eventually the Visigothic monarchy shrinks, and basically. And Ostrogotic Italy maybe a bit more by certain standards, because the Goths at that point seize Sicily. They control parts of the middle Danube, of the Alpine areas up to the Danube. They even expand in Provence, and in they control the also Illyria in part. So it's but I don't remember. The core is. Let's say of power is still Italy. In the case of the Franks, instead, they literally rule lots of other, not just lots of other lands, but also very definite populations of entire kingdoms. Just think about the Burgundians get assimilated, or the Alemanni, or in fact Aquitaine. So the imperial ideal in the Frankish world was strong, so that they didn't just represent a random Romano-Germanic kingdom that was just there waiting for the time to implode on itself, like it had happened with the Visigoths. With the Vandals. But they had larger ambitions. Then, of course, as we know, also the Frankish kingdom basically declines in the second half of the 6th century. There is a very transversal transformation in the Romano-Germanic world and in the Byzantine world as well that makes these powers shrinking into there is a major environmental collapse, structural collapse, but probably environmental base at one point. But eventually, the Frankish Empire is revived with the Carolingians. It is true that by the end of the 7th century, basically the Merovingian kingdom does not exist anymore because it's too fragmented. It's basically 4 separated kingdoms. But they all recognize this Frankish unity, also for reasons now they're complicated maybe to explain, because this is not a video specifically on the Franks, but let's say that there is a vocation, right? That there is a sort of tendency, orientation for the Franks to conceive themselves as emperors, or having an imperial-like rule. So even when Charlemagne was crowned Roman emperor by the Pope, well, that's not just an innovation, really. It was probably something that is still laid into the Frankish mindset that was really based, especially also more than other kingdoms, really on arms, like the idea that Northern Gaul wasn't that centralized or intensely Romanized, so that the Franks had maintained in many ways their lifestyle, their way of organized, let's say, of making war, of building power on a private base. They had more resources than they had in Germany, but they maintained their military retinues. And that's why, in a nutshell, the basis for the Carolingian vassalic beneficiary system and professionalization of the military retinues and the enlargement of their clienteles brings to the Carolingian Empire, right? There are also other factors. Technically speaking, it's a miracle that the Carolingian Empire existed in the first place, but it was a hell of a power, and it owed it to this kind of structural system, but also to what Clovis had set in here, especially on an imperial model. And it was normal for them to claim as virtually, emperors, let's say, even if they weren't called that way, up to Carolingian times, to conceive themselves like a challenge to the empire in itself. And never underestimate the psychological aspect of this story. I mean, never underestimate for a Frankish king like Clovis was, that had that passed from this essentially Frankish population scattered and divided at the outskirts of the Roman world, to become a kingdom that governs over other kingdoms, and that's what makes it an empire. The true belief in the fact that even the religious choice had been the right one. I mean, Clovis, when he's losing the battle against the Alemanni, and he invokes the Christian God and tells, if you let me win, I will. Let's see what you're capable of. Like, I've lost every hope. My own gods, in this sense, have abandoned me, have failed me. Show me what you're capable of, and I'll take the cross. And he obviously wins, because the battle is reversed. The Alemanni are defeated. Well, that is the key, even in the myth, even in the legend, because obviously we don't know what happened, right? We don't know if this is a legend that's been built afterwards, etc. But it's something fairly ancient to make us understand that that was the key. It was the passage to Romanization. There was a huge debate into this. That's why I made all that introduction, for example, about Arianism, about Germanism, because Clovis doesn't buy that. The Franks are the only people that pass from paganism to Catholicism. They do not pass through Arianism, because Clovis has this major power that he exercises in the most radically violent form. He literally beheads all the other Frankish chieftains. He massacres his loaders, but he gets it right. He creates something that lasts and lasts for pretty damn long. He understands that he needs the cooperation of the Gallo-Roman senatorial elite, of the bishops, of the Catholic population. And he gets that. And he creates an empire that is monstrous, because if you look at the map, you really can understand why the Byzantines were freaking out at that point for saying, well, what the Franks are doing here. So that is a pretty valid reason. And when the Byzantines had recognized the consular and patrician power to Clovis, well, that was a way to say, okay, we slow down. We accept your power in a way or another. We recognize it. We legitimize it, as long as you remain framed within this idea that that the empire does exist and you recognize its authority. Naturally, it was evident, even given the let's say the strategic capabilities of the Byzantines, that it would have been quite unlikely for the Franks to see their lands stripped away from the empire. Like, the empire couldn't really at that point take back from the Franks regions of northern the northern France. But it was still possible, in theory, also if the plague had not striked, and if there had been maybe some favorable conjunctions, that even the Frankish power could have been framed within a clearer imperial sphere, right? Instead, the plague arrives, and this thing is fundamentally reversed. But the Byzantines had tried to ideologically subordinate Frankish power to Constantinople. Simply, they had attempted to do it. So the creation of a Byzantine government in Ravenna which exercised its own direct action up to the borders of Gaul, up to the Alps, right, could therefore become the connection for a more consistent imperial influence up to the Atlantic Ocean. Was this feasible? We don't know. We can't really know this. But even if you take a map, you can realize pretty easily that these are, if the empire had managed to reconquer all the Mediterranean, it wasn't that difficult theoretically to arrive a few hundreds of kilometers away to the Atlantic through Aquitaine, fundamentally, right? And it's interesting also what the now I'm thinking also about other perspectives, really, because for example, Ostrogotic Italy had represented a very important point of reference for all those populations of Central Europe proper, chiefly of Germany, of the Germanic areas, that were kind of enemies or competitors with the Franks, right? Ostrogotic Italy being Arian also, so representing this kind of pro-German than more than pro-Roman side, had observed naturally the alliance between Constantinople and the Franks, right? When the emperor had entrusted the consular insignia and the patrician title to confer to Clovis, right? So it was this axis. I made a video about this between Ostrogothic Italy and Visigothic Spain, At one point, Theodoric also adopts the Visigothic heir to the throne because he was a minor, and they were both Aryan countries on the Mediterranean. They had this theoretically anti-Roman orientation, while the Byzantines and the Franks were trying to share a bit the illusion that they could make up an empire together. Like, maybe let's say I phrased this badly, but the theory was, okay, that the Franks were the Byzantine reference into the West, right? So there were lots of other peoples, for example, into Central Europe that, like the Thuringians, the Alemanni, etc., they were strongly anti-Roman, but in this sense they were also strongly anti-Frank. Like the Alemanni neither converted to Christianity, right? The Thuringians remained pagan as well. So what I'm thinking here, it would be interesting to study the relations, the few that is known about them at least, between the Byzantines and the Central European populations when the Byzantines conquered Ostrogotic Italy. And that's why also the Longobard migration in this sense would make sense, because the Longobards were partly of this technically Germanic Aryan populations. In fact, never framed themselves within the empire. The Longobards were very uncompromising with the empire. Even when they settled in Italy, that had been the heart of the empire, they refused any title from the emperor. They do not do anything like the Franks had done, which, by the way, makes them gain an enormous reputation among the other Germans. And even the same Franks that had chosen this other imperialistic path look upon the Longobards with great respect. They are basically the only people that they recognize as equals. And they and I suspect, in fact, that this the Byzantine adaptation into the process was now to become, paradoxically, a substitute of the Ostrogoths for those Central European populations that were worried about Frankish expansionism. And that's why, in fact, the Franks get settled into Italy. The Longobards get settled into Italy, and the thing is messed up at the end of the day, because they start fighting against everyone. They start fighting against the Byzantines. They even they cross the Alps. They go into Burgundy, that is subjected to the Franks at this point. So they're pretty pretty unruly in this sense. But they probably their settlement was an answer to Frankish expansion, right? And it's not a surprise that the Byzantines cared so much about Ravenna for this matter, because it really meant that they wanted to control all these movements of peoples between the Franks and the Longobards to hopefully stem the first with the latter, right? So I believe that this is very important as an interpretation, because before the plague, technically, everything was still feasible or possible, or at least it could be partially achievable had the Byzantines had more power, right? More resources, which at the end of the day they fail to have for many reasons. So the and consider also the Mediterranean perspective in here, what it means even for a Central European power as the Franks to fight eventually with the empire, right? Because there's a video, I don't remember the title of it, but I explained these things. If you give me 1 second, I don't repeat myself. But the concept in here is that if the Longobards hadn't settled into Italy, but obviously the Franks would have entered into, and the Byzantines would have entered into collision. It's obvious, right? I made 2 videos about this that you can find, or maybe more than than one. One is actually 6th century balance of power, Goths versus Franks and Constantinople. And that's a video in which I tell exactly this story in this period. Then you can look at all the other videos on the Franks that also explain strictly the Frankish perspective. But there are also, for later times, these other 2 videos that deal with this, the evolution of this, that incidentally speak of what was happening before as well in this period. One is the re-emergence of the Western Empire, balance between Franks, Byzantines, and Islam. So here we are pretty afterwards, but not so much, just it's a pair of centuries essentially. And then this other thing, Franks, Longobards, and Papacy, the early medieval crossroad, that also deals with that. So in a certain sense, the Longobards, there was a general collapse of the whole Mediterranean, European economy, etc. So everything shrank. It took other 2 centuries for even the Byzantines and the Franks to take strength, to gain momentum once again. And we see it in the 8th century. But if it hadn't been for the Longobards that put themselves in the middle and in this sense magically reuniting the Byzantines and the Franks that tried to wipe the Longobards out, probably with a sort of competition as well in this regard, the Franks were naturally projected towards Italy and the Mediterranean, and unavoidably in contrast with the Byzantines. And especially in Italy, probably they had an advantage, especially in northern Italy, because the empire was busy in controlling something else, essentially, on the eastern frontier, and then, of course, with the Islamic invasions, etc. But this is a perspective to be considered. The Longobard Kingdom as a kind of a bulwark, but also the Ostrogotic Kingdom previously, from controlling Frankish expansionism, right? In part because also in here, really, as long as the Frankish Empire was fragmented into the late 6th and the 7th century, but even up to the mid 8th century, it's not that the Franks or the Longobards were so unfriendly with each other. Like, the Franks were still busy to rebuild everything up. But you see that eventually ubi maior minor cessat, right? So the Carolingians, at the end of the day, probably the Pope had an important role into the process, but I think that even without the Pope, the Carolingians would have stepped into Italy at a point to another. Even if the Longobards had not been wiped out, or they had, they had remained. And they had not seized the papacy. All right. So, what is the point I wanted to make? Oh, well, yeah, the Mediterranean perspective. So you're a Frankish king, let's assume, and you look at the Mediterranean. By the mid-6th century, what you see is, okay, Italy is kind of penetrable, but what can you really do in there? Because, the Byzantines control the Tyrrhenian Islands, the Balearic Islands, the southern Iberian coasts. So, whatever this thing is, it's obvious that the Latin Germanic world had to remain conditioned by this happened military expansion, right? So this is deep as a concept, much deeper than it seems, because up to a few let's say generations before, there had been, for example, a Western Empire and an Eastern Empire, right? So these were theoretically 2 administrative repartitions, but by certain standards, they were 2 different empires, or at least 2 entities that weren't really the same thing. They usually cooperated. There was even some, hostility escalated into warfare once or twice, but let's say it wasn't really, it didn't make sense for the two Roman halves to fight each other, right? If not for maintaining, however, the whole thing united in a certain sense, so usurpations and so on. What happens with Justinian's Reconquest, where you can really think that maybe here it was an illusion for real, is that Justinian surpasses the equiparation of the supreme political responsibilities between East and West, and he realizes instead a form of very close, strong military and civil subordination of the conquered regions to the unique imperial court. That is, however, not really at the center of the Mediterranean. It's in the east. It's on the Bosphorus, right? So this was the challenge, in my opinion, of Justinian Reconquest more than else, is that where they probably overstretched and probably caused the major misconception how the thing had to be dealt, is that the balance of the empire was obviously too shifted to the east. I mean, you can't really control populations like Central Europe from the Bosphorus. You can't. I mean, yes, you can't control at this point the whole Mediterranean, but your bulk of power is still shifted in the east, and you have dramatically overstretched the boundaries with even, multiple frontiers now to control that require garrisons, money, etc. So this is the major criticism that kind of makes sense. I mean, what were really the Byzantines thinking? The Romano-Germanic kingdoms could react towards them. They probably thought they could be permeable to diplomacy and to the ideological supremacy of the Eastern Empire. And this tells a lot about the confidence, perhaps the overconfidence of Constantinople at this point. And where probably the causes of the imperial collapse really lay. Because many people say, well, what if there had not been the plague? Would the Byzantines have managed to reconquer the West more, like expanding to Central, East, Western Europe? The concept is that theoretically everything is possible, but and that was kind of feasible, but there was also an eastern frontier. There were other problems, and at the end of the day, there was this thin coastal areas that altogether could be easily reacquired in some form by the hinterland of the Visigoths, of the Franks, of the Longobards, and that's what happened at the end of the day. Because that's what happened to with Byzantine Italy, with Byzantine Spain, and partly with let's say the Byzantine presence, especially economically speaking, into southern France. So unfortunately, we know a few about how this balance really worked and how it, we can't quantify it properly. But it's also true that this appears an overstretch. Yet, the interest towards the areas of Central Europe is evident. The Byzantines probably counted on recovering, really, part of the rest of the empire. And that was probably a too long shot. They miscalculated it in some forms, right? We don't really know whether... This is also the point you may disagree with, because if you think about it, it's difficult to explain. Say, too speculative in any case. But the solidity of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms had been not so great. It was evident that the Byzantine, the Ostrogotic Kingdom had fallen relatively easily. The Vandal Kingdom had fallen easily, right? It's obvious that the Visigoths had let the Byzantines occupying southern Spain, that the Franks never fully engaged themselves at the end of the day into Italy or etc. They never quite committed those enormous resources that probably they had, but they couldn't channel into this broader, expansionistic policy without making their own system kind of collapsing and breaking down. So it was already a miracle that Clovis had managed to create what he created, and a conservative attitude would have been probably more sensible, and that's what happened at the end of the day, both cases. The ones who profited from this imbalance were the Longobards, incidentally, that created their own kingdom there. It was a hell of a kingdom, actually, because this is also what very few people know about the Longobards, because they stop to the beginning. They don't study Longobards history or how the Longobards institutions actually worked. They just have this picture that has been surpassed now from several generations about the fact that Longobards kingdom was weak and divided. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The myth of the division, especially, is so ridiculous by any single evidence we know about the Longobards kingdom. But about this, these are things I explain extensively into the Longobards history playlist, actually. So, as you know, it's difficult to get to the point of the story. Like, what is that we can say about these things? Really, nothing much. Right? Nothing. Nothing we can't really substantivize. There is not enough evidence. That's the real point. The rest is just it. But there are some attitudes, however, that show you that, at least in potential, the idea of this ability of projecting certain empires on, at an ecumenic level was present. And interestingly, was not just present into the empire that definitely had this by default, but it was being absorbed ideally also by other Romano-Germanic kingdoms. And in the case of the Franks, it's dramatically evident. And if you really scratch the surface, it's something you can't find in many other kingdoms. In other ways, the Visigoths do this from a ecumenical point of view, from a conciliar point of view with the councils of Toledo. There are other, even Anglo-Saxon England at one point uses the term empire or emperor for certain kings. In another context, and now obviously has no ambition towards the Mediterranean, but let's say that there is a wide, let's say there is an idea that the empire survives. The empire doesn't shrink into nothingness, and these populations know them because it's potentially a source of legitimization. I mean, these populations know that the empire can come back, theoretically. And they're not so excessively far from truth, right? And let's say it was theoretically possible, hadn't certain things happened. But this is not history, this is just, guessing just the imaginable in a world that didn't go this way, and that is important therefore to understand in the measures why it didn't go that way, so that we obviously have, for some reason, as moderns at least, this sympathy towards the eternal progress, like the idea that everything could have been reached, like in terms of expansion, of centralization, but you can't understand history at this point if you do not reflect on why it didn't happen. and it would be much easier to think of history, like, first of all, trying to understand why it didn't happen, and not to think about it, oh well, it didn't happen, so this sucks, so I can call this the Dark Ages because it doesn't correspond to what I think is cool. Because those people weren't really making history to please your expectations, but because they were trying actually to solve problems in the best ways, and it turns out that most of the times they did. So even, you know, the calibration of certain strengths and reaches are to be evaluated in this tension that probably was stretched between the possibility and the idea and the wish and the interest into expanding that far, but also the more consensus intelligence of saying, okay, now we can't really do that. We have to rationalize. We have to think it in a different way. So, okay. I don't know whether I was clear or not, because usually on these topics I tend to, let's say, go a bit far and wide, because I assume that this is a well-known topic, but it turns out it's not. But this is the reason why I made multiple videos, and I also address you to them, because you can get a bit better background and perspectives. And I was happy about this video because it answers to the ambitions of the Byzantines towards the the northwest, towards the Atlantic areas that is something you don't really hear very often. It would be interesting to frame, but there are so many. The imperial concepts are very important in my opinion, because we often, even given von Clausewitz that we discuss on this channel, you should try to enter into the mindset of what it means really to have an empire. I mean, how does really political and military power projects into a territory? Unfortunately, we are now formed our opinion on an empire on a 19th century model, right? For us, an empire is something very specific, with a central direction, a uniformation of the administration, with certain precise boundaries, borders, with certain specific agents that are referent to the central power. But this time was nothing like this, and yet real power existed. There is much debate, for example, what was the Hunnic Empire like? That there are people who, it's obvious that even up to Sweden, the Huns could extend their power objectively. That whenever, here we have to think it in a matter of influence. Just think, for example, how Clovis, how was it important for the Franks, for example, to control the Rhone Valley, and how already, entering into that particular context would have triggered the Byzantine, because those were regions that, as we were seeing, were traditionally Romanized, relatively faithful to the empire, at least in some ways, depending on the maritime trade, etc. So, with Constantinople, so it's a matter of choices, of thoughtful political consideration that, about which we unfortunately know nothing. I don't know what I would have to ask Clovis what he thought about this topics, but we can't do that evidently, and yet we can try to look better at this period. Can try to look better at the sources and reflecting on this dimension. And I'm personally not so let's simply say that we will talk about this again in the future. So for today, this is all. I think if you enjoyed this video, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.